Fuzz on Film podcast. I am Drew Taffendale, and with me are Scott Morris.
Hello.
And Craig Eastman.
Hiya.
The topic of this episode will be the film career of one Mr. Clint Eastwood, and we will be aiming to look at his progression from actor to director, and how he and his films have changed, and how successfully he has managed to transition to direction, including the rather difficult task of directing himself. While we are all long-term fans of old Clint, there is a particular reason we are doing this podcast right now. And that's because of a dream that Craig had that rather upset him.
I woke up inconsolable.
Yes, exactly the word.
Few things make me anxious in life, but one of those things is the realisation that Clint Eastwood is now 85 years old, and that statistically speaking, we are all incredibly likely to outlive him. And I woke up a couple of weeks ago, I suppose, in a blind panic because I had a dream that Clint Eastwood had died, and for a good couple of minutes anyway, whilst I sort of came to, I was inconsolable, and even for sort of half an hour after that, I was kind of feeling a bit down about it, even because it kind of brought about the realisation. And I think it's appropriate that if you're going to have a retrospective of someone's career, let's do it now, while the man's still alive.
Yes, exactly. That's, as Craig mentions, he is an elderly chap, but to make sure that we praise the man while he's alive, and to console Craig, we welcome you to Fuzz on Film's Clint Isn't Dead special.
Can I just point out at this phase as well? I'd like to point out the fact that from my understanding of the man's physical constitution, Clint Eastwood is probably in better general health than I am, even though he's got almost 50 years on me. Let's embrace the man's body of work and celebrate him now while he's still here, instead of waiting for the inevitable. Okay,
so we thought it would be best to begin with where Clint Eastwood really made his name. It came to the attention of most people, and that was with his early westerns. Most notably, I think, with his work with Sergio Leone in the Dollars trilogy.
Yeah, I mean, of course, he started with the TV show Rawhide, which, to be honest, apart from a few clips here and there, I've not really seen any of. That was a little before my time. However, it was, by most reports, a fairly traditional Western tale of drovers. The Sergio Leone stuff, of course, is quite a bit different from that. I've always found it a shame that, in general, I don't find Westerns more interesting, because it's got this great scope for historical examination, certainly better than almost any other kind of period piece. But some of the early examples of the genre were not made too long after the period that they depict, which does give you a great chance to examine the myth building and then the eventual deconstruction of that. So many of those early westerns, and much of Rawhide, was based on a fairly simplistic black hat, white hat moralising. It's more acceptable than the other tropes that it went around, which is basically othering Native Americans as wild savages only fit for slaughter. But in many ways, early westerns are an attempt at eulogising this brutality and the shaky grasp of law the USA spread westward held. But Leone's westerns remain notable in large part because he brought a more European perspective to this myth building, and not just in terms of his cast. The Italians are, I suppose, uniquely positioned to comment on empire building and the subsequent decay, and that translates through into a somewhat more nuanced, or at least much less starkly defined, morality of Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. I picked Fistful as a representative sample, largely because it's the first one. As far as Clint's concerned, that's accurate. He plays the mysterious, unruffled, wisecracking outsider character, and that's something that he will draw on again throughout his career. For Leone, I suppose it's a bit of a false reading. Of course, Fistful of Dollars is great, but that's because it's a blatant retread of Yojimbo. That said, the positives in Fistful do carry through to all the rest of the films. Eastwood has a restrained, cucumber-cool performance in all of the series. It's became rightly iconic, almost as iconic as Ennio Morricone's trilogy of classic scores, and Spain does a very good impersonation of Mexico. Leone brings a very different eye to the genre, with a wildly effective mix of wide shots and extreme close-ups that do a great job of building drama and conveying the setting. So watching all these through again recently, it's remarkable how well they've held up. They have that element of grit, this element of somewhat deconstructing the myth of the Western ethos. It's something that you'll see going more and more into the Western reality. The interesting thing about Westerns, of course, is that they have changed over time. Now you very rarely see something as simplistic as the John Wayne films of yesterday. Now they tend to be a bit more brutal and a bit more, for want of a better term, realistic. Wouldn't say that any of these Leone films are particularly realistic, but they are incredibly enjoyable. amazingly well paced. They look beautiful. Basically, there's not really much that you'd want to change in them, even years after the fact. They all held up incredibly well. For Clint Eastwood, of course, he is rightly iconic in it. It's a very great role for him, and it's a particularly effective role for him to kind of start off his film career. The knock, I guess, I read one quote that's supposedly from Leone saying that at this point in his career, Eastwood had two expressions, with hat and without, which I think is being a little harsh.
Yeah, well, I was going to say there that, I mean, I think the Leone westerns are where Clint Eastwood really sort of got his trademark, first displayed at least his trademark gruffness and his stares, and I always thought that it would have been so easy for him to be sort of the gruff stary man, but I think he's, even though like in most films he's gruff stary man, he's a different gruff stary man.
His gruff stariness is versatile.
Yes, there's a nuance to his gruff stariness.
There's an economy to those films and Leone's style that I think Eastwood's sort of persona at that point probably played into. That's how I would. I think they meshed quite well. I think that's how I'd describe it.
Yeah, certainly a trio of very minimal performances. There's not much overblown histrionics or anything like that. So, in fact, there's very little spoken dialogue in it at all. It's just lots of staring and. And
Eastwood has one of cinema's greatest staring faces.
Yeah.
If I edited together, I feel like doing a supercut of just every scene where Clint Eastwood is basically standing silently, chewing on a cheroot or something.
That's most of the film.
Just staring someone out. And I would watch that on loop until the day I die. Even at, I mean, what age was he then?
30s.
He was in his mid-30s or something like that, right?
Even
at that age, he had a face that was lived in, and that kind of just a certain gravitas that few people have just in terms of their physical presence on screen. Few people have that presence just in terms of, here's my image on celluloid, drink it in. He's one of the few people who has that kind of physical and photogenic presence. Even now, I can think of very few actors who have had that, and that's absolutely one of, especially in those early films, absolutely one of his trump card. Not to say that that's his stock in trade, but it certainly served him well. Yeah, just I suppose if we're covering the trilogy, there's certainly not one of them that I wouldn't wholeheartedly recommend. Fistful of Dollars, of course, as I said, because it is based so heavily on Yojimbo, it's got a solid base to build from, and I think it does a very good job of that. A few dollars more, the second one perhaps gets a little bit lost in the shuffle, but I think that's a little unfair. Again, another iconic score. The support from Lee Van Cleef is also pretty well effective too. It gives a welcome sort of second access for the films to kind of pivot around, and I think it provides a welcome change up to the formula. They're all basically the same tales of outsiders going about their business, and they're all great. The Good, the Bad and the Ugly is probably the best. Another set of great performances for the three sort of central characters to bounce off, as well as having the same positives that all the rest of the series had. They all look great, they all sound great. Yeah, there's a real progression to the films too in terms of sort of their depth and their story. A Fistful of Dollars is fairly minimal in that regard. Then the story just gets a sort of richer story for a few dollars more. Than The Good, the Bad and the Ugly is a very, very ambitious one. It's much longer, it has more characters, more story, but it's both the actor improving there and the director becoming more confident as well. I mean, obviously these weren't Leone's first films, but you see him improving his craft as it goes along. Yeah, something that Eastwood will have again throughout his career, but these films were just panned critically for the most part when they came out, and it's looking back, it's baffling to think how you could have underestimated these so much. They were treated as parodies. They were treated as being too violent. They were essentially ignored, which is very strange in retrospect, given that they clearly are very, very good films. I mean, if you look at the genre of westerns as a whole, and I think Sergio Leone is clearly the master of it. It's so strange that they were dismissed then. Yes, I know very much that they were derided as being too violent because all of that murdering of Indians, that was wholly non-violent, wasn't it? Yeah, but that was allowable propaganda. It's interesting the way that films are used as a kind of propaganda, these sort of things. I think that is part of the whole mythos of the Western. It was used to, the films were being used to justify the actions of recent history, very recent at the start of these, and taking over the place. Sort of the early John Ford stuff, the 1930s, that's just a couple of decades after this stuff was still going on. So yeah, it's quite interesting. But then somebody comes along and does something different, and oh no, they're a dirty foreigner. Yeah, and you can see the same sort of parallel as like any of these dramatic things. It does take a while for cinema to kind of catch up and be able to do more nuanced representations of it.
This is why I think the spaghetti westerns are so well remembered, because it was the start of the western genre starting to get a modicum of self-reflection and a bit of historical perspective that was really lacking before then. And you'll see the same kind of things when you see the films made after the Second World War, for example. They start off being, boys' own comic book adventures about gunning down evil Nazis, and it was only over time. It takes a long time for you to get to downfall. So, yep, they're all very heartily recommended, and I think you can't really go wrong with any of them. Any of Leone's westerns are great.
Yay, Leone's westerns.
Okay, so that's really where Clint Eastwood made his name, quite trademark look about him too. So we're going to jump forward quite a bit in time to another series of films that are probably as iconic for Clint Eastwood, if not more so, and that's as a certain Inspector Harry Callahan of the San Francisco Police Department.
Yeah, I think these two franchises, for me at least, are certainly the elephants in the room, so it's good to get them out of the way first. In a lot of ways, Dirty Harry is basically taking the same character and moving him forward in time, putting him in a suit and giving him a gun. Harry's, of course, the by this point, so iconic hard-boiled cop that I don't really think there's any point giving a lot of detail on how it goes.
He's the prototypical maverick, isn't he?
Yeah, he's someone who does not like what City Hall is doing and is happy to go his own way. I mean, the interesting thing about the first one is that really does, not only is that sort of the central tenet of his character, but it does come back to bite him on the ass. One of the more interesting things about this is Harry goes on the trail of a serial killer. He's cutting corners, he is doing the whole right-wing arguments for police brutality, and where the ends justify the means, the whole sort of ticking time bomb kind of thing, where he's happy to beat information out of people, and it turns out you can't do that, and that's why the killer is wound up released to perform the kind of final act of the movie, which is a kind of interesting little, not exactly twist, but certainly an interesting development, which I don't think you'd seen in a great many other things.
No, and something which a lot of people gloss over when they cite this as the great right-wing movie and the sort of the beginning of that persona, because obviously Eastwood himself is a flag-waving Republican, right?
Yeah,
and something of a masthead for the right wing in certain ways, and Dirty Harry would certainly seem to be the keystone character for that movement. Few people actually bother to stop and contemplate the fact that, as you point out, within the film itself, it's highlighted that that's something that you can't get away with.
The way it's presented, although it is not particularly taking sides, I think it does kind of lend itself towards the side of being that, Harry should be allowed to do rampage his way throughout San Francisco. I think wisely it's never really returned to for the rest of the series, apart from it kind of becoming almost to the point of self-parody that anywhere this man goes, trouble and gunshots will follow. But it's never sort of brought up again in a kind of political context for the most part, and that might be a good idea. But certainly as a film, though, the first Dirty Harry is rightly a blueprint for many other people to start taking their examples from. It's got the amazingly memorable central character in Dirty Harry. Dirty, of course, because he's doing the jobs no one else wants. He acts the way that a lot of cops, I think, would like to be able to act. But certainly in the context of it being a film and not actual reality, it's fun to watch, although I don't think I'd want it happening in real life. That said, it is of course fun to watch. There's a memorable central villain with the Scorpio killer, who's sort of playing somewhat over the top, but a very effective and memorable villain who's certainly not lacking on the evil plans. It makes for a really entertaining watch as we try and track down this ne'er-do-well. And yeah, it just generally works very well and holds up incredibly well. Another great soundtrack, Lalo Schifrin inventing acid jazz about 20 years before it actually existed, so another tremendous sort of set of theme music from him. And yeah, it's very pacey, it's very punchy. It has, of course, the memorable handgun, and it's just a terrific movie. It's still enjoyable to this day. The same can't be said for most of the rest of the franchise. The next one in the series, Magnum Force, I think, still holds up pretty well.
Magnum Force is okay.
Yeah, although, I mean, there are warning signs in Magnum Force that things are not going to go all that well, because in the opening credits of Magnum Force, they start using his catchphrase and put it up on screens. That's quite worrying when a film series starts going for that sort of thing so early on.
Yeah.
I guess for me the most interesting thing about Magnum Force is that it's a series. He's going up against a number of cops who are doing the thing that you could accuse Dirty Harry of doing in the first one, but of course they would have taken it too far, and he's ready to uphold the law against the policemen who are doing that, which is an interesting kind of moral twist based on the first one, I think.
It's interesting that they decided to, because there are probably any number of avenues that a sequel to this could have gone down, but for them to actually hold the mirror up to the character and say, well, look, what's the difference between you and these guys? Let's discuss that a little bit deeper, even if the answers aren't all that greatly well considered. Is still at least a sort of a vaguely different direction, certainly at that point in time, for a sequel to have gone in. Yeah. It's not the least interesting thing that they could have done. Yeah, and again, I think for most of the rest of it, the other elements of the film kind of back it up as well. It's still, punchy and pacey. Clint Eastwood is still basically playing the same character, all of them. You won't find a lot of progression of his character in the Dirty Harry films. It's not the avenue for them, but he does play it incredibly well. So it's still enjoyable on those bases. So yeah, Magnum Force is still worth a watch. The other ones I was going to say you can take them or leave them, but I think in most instances you're better off just leaving them. You can leave them. The Deadpool's almost, which was the fifth and last Dirty Harry film, and the only one of the 80s, I think, is almost worth a look in. Just as a show. It's one of those films. It's one of those films that the guys from How Did This Get Made might want to look at some point, because actually it's just a little bit insane. I think it is worth watching just so you can see a very early Jim Carrey performance, and also a performance where he dies, which I think is probably the highlight of the film for me, along with his incredibly silly dance that he's doing in Liam Neeson's horror movie set. Ludicrous. Yeah, so the Deadpool was a horrible way to round things up, but The Enforcer was a third in the series. It's not much better. It does have one positive, I guess. It does have a fairly strong female lead character, which is, for a franchise that is a bit of a sausage fest, quite a positive. Unfortunately, it's not really backed up with much of a story. He's going up against a terrorist force, paramilitary force, which doesn't seem to have any particular goal in mind. It's more of they're terrorists in the Hans Gruber sense of the word, where they're really just after money. There was possibly a way you could have explored that, but it kind of just gets a bit bored with it and tries to go, well, let's kidnap the mayor and have a shootout, and it ends in a sort of wet fart of a way in Alcatraz, and it all seems... It's certainly not that it's got a great feminist agenda. When you say it's interesting in that it's got this strong female lead, it's not that it was a wonderfly progressive piece of women's lib or anything. It's still very much the case that by the end of the film he has grudgingly accepted that this broad might actually be reasonably good at her job. It's not that she's treated as an equal from the start, or there's any acknowledgement that she should be a good police officer to begin with.
I suppose one of the, not sure if at this point it's a positive or negative about the film, but Eastwood, the initial script drafts of this apparently had much more character interaction and much more character development for Dirty Harry and Tyke Daly's character. With her. No, apparently there was some actual emotions on display, but Eastwood kiboshed that on the basis that it was getting in the way of the action, which he felt was what people were going to see the franchise for. And while that's maybe disappointing from a sort of general film quality perspective, I suppose you can't actually argue with the man in terms of knowing which side his bread's buttered. These films were still very successful on the basis that they were formula cop dramas that did tremendous box office, so he knew commercially what the right decision was, but I think in terms of the actual quality of the film, I think that was a somewhat of a misstep. I suppose we'll round out the franchise with Sudden Impact, the 1983 vehicle, which basically doesn't feel like a Dirty Harry film at all. I believe that there was at least some conceptualising of this being a trilogy of films, but this fourth one is basically just bolted on. It feels like it could be a completely different script entirely, barring like the obligatory shootouts at the start, just to establish that yes, Dirty Harry still has a gun and will shoot people with it. But it kind of deals with Harry being exiled off to a smaller California town to investigate a murder, and gets involved in a rape victim getting in revenge on those who raped her from some time ago. And it kind of doesn't really play anything like a Dirty Harry film. It's not a bad film, but it feels very much like Dirty Harry guest starring in another script for some reason, and that's okay. It probably hangs together better as a film than The Enforcer did, but it's still largely forgettable. Is Sudden Impact the one that is basically there to showcase the Magnum Auto Mag? Yes. That is probably the single most memorable thing in the film, although it never actually gets shot, because there no blanks existed for those cartridges at the time, so anytime it's shot is actually a different model of gun.
I'm sorry, it was just that thing of, at this point the franchise had just become such a copy and paste, and how, sort of incremental steps in how ludicrous they could be, and we need a new catchphrase for this one, and okay, what's he going to kill the bad guys with now? We can't just fall back on the old 44 Magnum anymore, and of course that the very notion of that climbs in a rocket and goes to the moon for the last for the Deadpool when he offs Liam Neeson with a harpoon gun.
Yeah.
The size of an outhouse.
Not to spoil the ending, of course, but it's not actually Liam Neeson in that one. It's the guy pretending to be Liam Neeson.
That's right. Yes, sorry, of course.
And pretending to do Liam Neeson's terrible accent at the same time.
Yeah, it's disappointing that the franchise sort of fell, disappeared down the toilet at this point, because there are certainly themes there that could have been explored a little bit more in depth, and even just with the material they had, something more interesting could have been done with it. Was Deadpool one of his directorial efforts? No, it wasn't. It wasn't. No, and one can only imagine the reason for him accepting to do that was a large dumper truck full of money pulled up outside his home one time. Yes.
And discharged into it. I mean, in terms of, if you're going to talk about his progression, then I suppose you start off with, the original Dirty Harry being, a fairly good example of him in a film. It's still relatively early in his career, and he does really well in it. But then he does the same thing again and again. So by the time you get through to Deadpool, which was 88, it's like, he could be doing better than this. I think it shows a bit of sort of mid-career stagnation, I think, in terms of the Dirty Harry franchise. It starts off very well, it starts off positive, but all those positives are gradually eroded over time. And
the 80s in general, by the time we get to those last two films, the 80s in general were, let's say, a bit of a vacuum for him. Probably his weakest decade. But let's not forget that in the same year as he brought us Dirty Harry, he also gave us Play Misty For Me.
Yes, which we said we would cover, largely because if you are going to show a progression of someone's career, it's useful to show absolute zero, which is more or less Play Misty For Me. Now, it is not the worst film in the world, and I'm surprised to see, I hadn't noticed until just earlier today when I was doing some bit of research, that it's actually still quite well regarded. So Ebert gave it 4 out of 4. I apparently was watching a different film, because Play Misty For Me, while it's by no means terrible, it's a series of decisions, all of which are wrong. The basic story is Clint Eastwood's playing a DJ, and a fan phones up to request Misty being played for her. Many occasions she becomes an obsessed character. She kind of seeks him out. They have a romantic entangling, but it turns out that she's a bit of a crazy stalker type, and
just a bit.
Winds up going overboard and eventually threatening Eastwood's other kind of long-term on-again, off-again girlfriend. I think the central problem that makes this film just outright strange to watch is that it seems like Eastwood went back to his default character. It was like, I'm going to do a tough outsider character, wisecracking, all these kind of things. That works if you're a lone gunman. It works if you're a cop on the edge. It doesn't work if you're a DJ.
So an easy listening DJ at that too. There's nothing edgy about the music he played or anything.
No. You have this sort of strange choice for the performance of the central character, and when you combine that with the very overblown histrionic performances that you get from Jessica Walter, it just doesn't kind of match up, because you're never really going to feel any sort of threat from her to him, because he's clearly Dirty Harry. It doesn't kind of match up particularly well. It's just a bit amateurish in a great many respects. It feels like Eastwood's just fallen back to type. I think if he'd not been directing himself here, he might have had someone to give him a sounding board to sort of change the direction on the character. Yeah, I think he might have reined Jessica Walters in a bit from going sort of wildly overboard.
And in his defence though, and it's why it's worth mentioning Play Misty For Me, and it's a fairly unremarkable film if technically reasonably competent, I would guess, is that it is his first feature as a director, but it's something I think's come up again in his other career too, is that in the rest of his career sometimes he doesn't really seem to want to focus on himself that much. But in this case he also hasn't focused on everybody else, because that woman's chewing the scenery, and yes, as you said, he's playing the character all wrong. basically he's Dirty Harry as a DJ, and that just doesn't make any sense at all.
And there's so many other smaller bad decisions all the way throughout it, like the way some of it's cut. He's having a conversation with his Donna Mills' character, and it's a 3-minute, maybe 5-minute conversation, something like that, but that is then cut over footage of an entire day's worth of them sort of wandering about and, you know, fooling around on the beach and these kind of things, and it's just very strangely done. It's like they've said one sentence in the morning and 2 sentences in the afternoon and another 3 sentences in the evening. It's so that was their one conversation. They were just quiet in between all of that. It's just weird.
Yeah, I think you've got to see that as him kind of just playing with all the tools he had with him and beginning to learn his craft, but it doesn't make for a good viewing experience.
I mean, that's fine, but I mean, that's why film school exists, and why people don't release them into the cinema multiplexes. Also, it's rather effectively underwhelmed by trying to build tension by playing a song called Dirty Boogie by Gator Creek as the sort of main tension driving recurring theme. And I invite anyone to go and check that out on YouTube if you've not heard of Gator Creek's Dirty Boogie, and try and imagine if you can anything less tension building than this. What a choice.
It's interesting for a first directorial effort, because bear in mind that, I mean, although his career started in B movies, I mean, still he's been working with directors for 16 years by this point. So you'd think he would have picked up some fairly solid tricks of the trade along the way. Having said that, it's been something like 20 years since I last saw this movie, so I'm not best placed to comment on it. I remember kind of liking it, but whether or not that's because my critical faculties were at a point where I could analyse it properly is another thing. But
I mean, as I say, you will find worse films in the world, and possibly even worse films that Eastwood's been in. However, it's not really worth digging out as anything other than a historical curiosity.
The best thing I can say about it is that it's not awful, but as Scott says, I wouldn't bother seeking it out. And you're saying, Craig, too, that he's been around all these other directors and you think he'd have learned something. I think it might be something akin to like the teenage rebellion thing of like, well, no, I know better, I'm going to do things my own way. Because you see in his later career,
here's my badge, damn it.
You see very much in his later career that clearly learned from some of the great directors he worked with, because there's definite similarities in style, and you can see their influence in his work. Whereas for Play Misty, for me, it being his first film, I think it was like, yes, I'm going to do this my way. And I think he had enough savvy to look at it and go, yeah, maybe not so much.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of his career does seem to be defined by him looking for respect from critics, from audiences, everything like that, and it does seem that has been certainly in his early career was a fairly central driving force to him. He always felt he was kind of hard done by not getting the breaks he deserved. But I think in retrospect, a lot of it is justified why he wasn't actually getting the respect that he deserves. I mean, there's certainly nothing in Play Misty for me that would immediately mark him out as a fantastic director, and he does kind of go back. He did spend a lot of time going back to the same characters and not really developing his craft, you could argue. There's
a lot of evidence there. I mean, like say on his directorial resume of certainly him having serious pretensions in that field, but then it's surprising actually when you look back and you consider that sort of a third of his career has been comprised of directing. Yeah, that actually quite how many sort of utterly throwaway, clearly for the paycheck kind of potboilers are in there that. Yeah. They don't even seem to be serving as, taking, look, I'm going to take this directing gig sort of to try and noodle away at developing some sort of style of my own. It veers wildly and delivers really, really mixed results. Yes. Which
sounds like a lead into the next film.
Yeah, it sounds like a lead into the next film. It may well be 1982's Firefox, about which I don't have a great deal to say. I mean, it kind of, if you look back at his directorial career, starting with Play Misty for Me in 1971, High Plains Drifter, 73, not a terrible movie, and then you hop into a film we're going to be discussing fairly soon on I think a commentary podcast, The Eiger Sanction, in 1975, which is bafflingly out there in terms of style and content and intent. And it's kind of like the odd and even numbered Star Trek films. If you go through his career as director, there's like, okay, here's one where I clearly had my eyes on some sort of statuette, followed by one where apparently I seem to have been taking a great deal of acid or something that week. I don't know. Firefox 1982 kind of kind of sums up nicely the 80s for him, if you think about it in terms of those last couple of Dirty Harry films, and then this being where he was at both as actor and director. Utterly disposable potboiler, completely unremarkable, nothing memorable at all really in terms of characterization. I mean, a great concept based on the novel of the same name, and actually based on the true life events of loosely based on true life events of, or let's say inspired by the story of the Russian MiG pilot who had defected to Japan, although Russian pilots and MiGs is pretty much where the similarity ends.
Yes, I'm sure there was a lot of neurally controlled interfaces with a jet fighter in the real story, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll get on to the lack of sophistication around that stuff in a minute, but I mean, on the face of it, actually an interesting plot. The Russian military have developed a new MiG fighter craft, the 35, I think, which, amongst other things, can travel at Mach 6, can outfly radar signatures, so therefore, for all intents and purposes, is invisible to radar, is entirely nuclear capable, and has the ace up its sleeve of a thought-controlled weapon system, which basically removes...
If only not dealt that ace, it would have been a much better film.
Which, as far as I can tell, simply removes the necessity for a pilot to press a button. So a great technological leap for all of the R&D cost that it's implied was pumped into this by the Soviets. Obviously, removing the need to press a button is something that the US military simply cannot allow the Soviets to have in the midst of the Cold War. If anyone's not going to press a button, it'll be us, damn it. And so I don't want them not pressing a button better than we can not press a button. Find us our best Vietnam War pilot. Eastwood stars as the former Vietnam veteran US Air Force pilot who's called back into service, not just to fly this plane, but actually to infiltrate the test facility where this prototype is being housed, and exfiltrate it from, I think, is it Siberia? I can't remember. It didn't seem all that important at the time. It certainly doesn't seem important now. Yeah, that's basically.
I'm pretty sure that was his tagline. It didn't seem important now. It's not important now.
You've never been so terrified by someone not pressing a button. Basically a very standard structure, a film of 3 acts, convincing. Act 1, convincing Eastwood to get back in the game. Act 2, infiltrating the facility, and then Act 3, which is him trying to get the plane back to United States soil, all the while being pursued by another Firefox prototype, which is a bit of an inconvenience for him, really, to find out there's another pilot with the capability to not press a button as equally as he can not press a button. But what's notable really is this point, over a decade after Play Misty With Me, is kind of the lack of directorial sophistication, the really unnecessary sort of voiceovers, the whole sort of, I'm having flashbacks to Vietnam while I'm flying the plane, I've lost control of the plane. There's really, I remember loving this film as a kid. I think I saw this film, I must have been 10, 11 when I first saw this film. And I remember thinking it was the best thing since sliced bread. And going back to view it now, it's remarkable in that, from what I remember, it's probably a leap back from where he started his directorial career. That kind of sums up his period in the 80s in a nutshell. I get the feeling that both as a director and as an actor, things had run away from Eastwood a little bit, and he probably needed to take some time out to gather his thoughts and make his comeback.
Yeah, I can kind of see a skeleton of a pretty decent film in Firefox. I was sure I'd seen this film before, but apparently I was thinking of the web browser because I hadn't until a few weeks back. But
I resisted making that terrible pun, but thank you. Somebody needed to.
There's 2 quite good acts there. Now I would argue with implementation details of the way that Eastwood shows his flashbacks to Vietnam is, shall we say, not subtle. That could have been handled better, but if you do that, cut out the silly flight thought-to-control interface, which is completely unnecessary for the rest of the film.
Yeah, and necessitates the voiceover mumblings of, how do I say fire in Russian?
It's just silly. It really does hamper the last act where he's trying to do an escape, but all he can really do is narrate, I am flying away from Russia. and somehow drag that out into about 20 minutes, and it is about as boring as you can think of. If it had perhaps more, perhaps if you had the computer graphics available today, you could have done a fairly remarkable job with aerial combat set pieces towards the end, but not something that was available back then. And apparently they didn't have any real budget for any great special effects, because there's really almost nothing of note happens at all in the end sequence. It's all basically people standing around control rooms going, he's flying north, no, he's flying south now, oh, we'd better move some missiles to the south, oh, he's escaped.
It's kind of annoying because it came just off the heels of a couple of halfway decent thrillers, like The Gauntlet in 1977 and Escape from Alcatraz in 1979 are both really solid films, and I watched those both again recently, and they still hold up fairly well. And then for him to take a stab at sort of directing something in a thriller genre, although I guess it's more of a sort of an espionage thing, and for it to be so not even lukewarm is really, really disappointing. Like you say, there's the skeleton of a decent film there.
If nothing else, the admission at the start of just the Soviets having out-engineered us on this, oh dear, we better do something about it, is refreshing in that kind of era. I know there's obviously it's playing a bit on the Sputnik space race kind of thing, but I think that's an interesting way you could take these kind of things. It's like, we are behind, we're in desperate peril, we need to ramp up our game by stealing this back, and that works. And a lot of the spycraft in the second act is relatively interesting. Again, not particularly subtle, but it's doing its job pretty well. It's quite effective from what it's doing. But that final act is just atrocity, and I can't quite recover from that.
It's most notable at this point for having, I think I'm correct in saying, listening, I wasn't really aware of the sort of mechanics of the effects up until I listened to the Optical podcast recently, who devoted an episode to this. And from what I gather, it's pretty much notable at this point only for the development of a particular new optical technique in the matting during the flight sequences at the end. And other than that, it's really left no kind of mark whatsoever, no footprint whatsoever in cinema history.
Along with most of the 80s output of Eastwood has largely been consigned to the memory hole.
Yes.
Yes, it was definitely not his strongest decade, was it?
Well, listen, I know people who swear by Heartbreak Ridge. I don't buy into it myself.
Oh no, because that's terrible.
Yes, I mean, at the time, I think it was reasonably well received, but it's not held up well whatsoever.
I think I remember liking Heartbreak Ridge when I was 7.
Yes.
I'd had no critical faculties.
Absolutely. And listen, I've got to say, rounding out the decade, but by the time we get to 1990, he'd taken a beating the year before. Pink Cadillac was like a massive flop. White Hunter, Black Heart, sort of a vague attempt again at him trying to do something serious in I think probably the first or certainly closest thing he'd come to doing the biopic by that point. But The Rookie in 1990, I just want to put it out there right now, I've got a real soft spot for. I know no one else on the planet will agree with me, but I thought it was a massive amount of fun. Again, a film that he directed and starred in. And before we get to probably, I think, the next film that we're going to talk about, it kind of, for me, I know probably, again, no one will agree with me on this. It kind of took those elements of all the sort of things he was taking a stab at with his films, sort of from the Eiger Sanction through to the Firefox, that sort of pot boiler thing. That sort of, I found it a great deal of fun. At least he sort of ended that decade by saying, here's this film which is just at least a good deal of fun, over the top nonsense that it is. But I enjoyed it thoroughly.
I'm glad that you enjoy it.
And I guess that leads us probably into what I guess most people would describe as a Kinnear renaissance then, right? Unforgiven.
It's strange that this film should come just after a decade in which he had so many, let's be generous and say, unspectacular films. Whether perhaps he spent that decade learning lots and lots of ways to do things wrong was how he came to finally do something so very right. But Unforgiven was Eastwood's 10th film in the genre, which made him a star, the Western. And it came just a couple of years after the two directors with whom he was most associated, Don Siegel and Sergio Leone, had died. You add to that the fact that the cinema Western was, in 1992, pretty much dead. And it altogether seems fitting that Eastwood himself would direct this tale of a dying and changing West, where the gunslingers of lore passed into legend and into the pages of Pulp Fiction. And Eastwood himself plays William Money, a violent killer who found some sort of salvation in his late wife and who renounced alcohol and murder to become a pig farmer and raise his children. Now, unfortunately for all concerned, keeping things alive and well isn't something that Money's particularly good at. And when an opportunity arises to make some money by bounty hunting, Money just can't say no. And the opportunity in question is to kill 2 cowboys who mutilated a prostitute, and the $1,000 bounty has been put up by the prostitutes themselves after they felt failed by Gene Hackman's sheriff, who was considerably less interested in doling out justice and more interested in keeping his town running smoothly, and just made sure instead that their pimp was recompensed for loss of business. So the setup of that film is fairly straightforward. Man needs money, man sees opportunity to get money. After that, it all goes a bit pear-shaped. As I mentioned earlier about Eastwood in his beginning days, particularly his play Misty For Me, having decided that he would go his own way, it's this film more than any other, I think, where you really begin to see the influence of Leone and Siegel in particular, and the other directors he worked with. Here it's particularly Don Siegel's disdain for sentimentality and Leone's deliberate, masterful pacing and handling of action sequences. And both are applied here expertly by Eastwood. It is like the 80s didn't happen to him. He got through that decade of it. Oh, yes, this is how you make a film, right? And Unforgiven is, like so many westerns, a morality tale. But there's no space here for sentiment. It's just a study in human nature. And unlike the westerns in which he started, like Rawhide, it's, as Scott mentioned earlier about and carrying on from what I'd seen in Leone's work, it's a western that reflects on what might have actually happened. It wasn't propaganda. It's far, far more reflective. And the characters here, I wouldn't say there aren't any villains, in as much as possibly there are only villains. Because along the way, it undermines many of the legends of the West. It entirely eschews any glamour, and it suggests the type of truth behind the stories that became widely disseminated through the penny dreadfuls of the day. Yeah, because in this, you've got a man who starts out redeemed and gradually, the course of the film, becomes unredeemed because he can't fight his own nature, and that's a large part of the point of this film. It's about human nature, and there's morality here, but it's morality as in terms of what people would actually do as opposed to what you'd want them to do. What's particularly good about this, as well as the strength of the directing, is that Eastwood on screen as well has a real power to him. We talked before about him being, the gruff, starey man, but he has that same incredibly strong screen presence he had in Leone's work. And perhaps here he's so powerful because he just seems so at home in the Western setting. But even though he's getting on in years, there's a believable, almost palpable sense of menace to Eastwood's William Money as the brutal and dangerous young gunslinger gradually emerges from the body of the old hog farmer, like some sort of malevolent butterfly. And Money is like an avenging angel, ensuring that most of the people get what's coming to them, even if this particular angel is more of a devil in disguise.
I think people make the big mistake is that people call this his career comeback and his sort of first great directorial effort, but that is to discount Bird, which I think was 2 or 3 years prior to that. Oh no, actually 4 years prior.
So even before that, yeah.
Yeah, which was sort of his passion pick at that point, a biopic of Charlie Parker.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really well received, and actually is for me the first sort of great directorial outing of his that certainly that I've seen. I know that other films prior to that were certainly well received, but that for me is sort of a forerunner to Unforgiven. Which at this point, did we decide yet whether or not I'd seen Unforgiven?
You have seen Unforgiven. You just don't seem to remember it.
I just don't seem to remember it all that well, which is peculiar. There you go, for a number of reasons. But yeah, I can't really comment on it for that reason.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, no worries, man.
Yeah, I very much like it for more or less the reasons I was talking about with Leone's spaghetti westerns, whereas you could argue that was the start of the dirtying up of the western genre. This is kind of a logical conclusion to it. It almost literally starts with him face down in the dirt and basically morally doesn't go much up from there. Yeah, so it's certainly not a film that glamorizes anything. There's no real happiness in here, and that's kind of what makes it effective in the end. It's showing a kind of logical conclusion to the lives that these kind of guys would have led, and things like the Philip Schofield kid winding up, the way his character winds up at the end of the thing is kind of somewhat more of a realistic interpretation of how things might have actually went in these eras. There's no glamour to it at all.
Yeah, it's a film chock full of analogies too, in all sorts of ways, and sometimes in terms of the filmmaking too, because it is the progression of how the Western film was made, as well as being the progression of the West too, that the West changed and became more civilized, that these people who had been gunslingers don't really know what to do with themselves in a more civilized West, whereas you've got characters who in films at least set earlier and definitely made earlier would have tried to sort the problems out themselves and go and shoot people. In this case, they turned to the law. Unfortunately, the law in this case is Gene Hackman's little Bill Daggett, who thinks he's running something in some sort of order, but is just as bad as the people he's trying to keep out. But it's all to do with passing of time and changing, which is the case in a lot of more recent westerns too. That it's the change of the world.
But again, I think it's a really great film. Again, it's not one that just holds up very well. I guess in part because I suppose it's easier for westerns to hold up because they don't look like they've aged if they've been done well in the first place.
They tend to feel quite timeless. Yeah,
and that does work in its favour. Again, it's very well paced. It's very well acted. It's a very effective performance from Eastwood. It's the start of his grumpy old man persona. Was obviously a sight to behold. It's good to see the genesis of that.
You really do see the influence of Siegel and Leone here, and it's like clearly and not to take away from it being Eastwood's own skill that's managing this film, but you see that he's worked with these people and understands like the deliberation of Leone's action pieces, and that his films aren't emotionless, but he just got no time for sentimentality at all, and Don Siegel never did either.
Mm-hmm.
But you see also just that it's weird. I mean, I know Craig, you say you like Bird very much, but which I've not seen myself. But there's just such a jump from the likes of Firefox to this. That's like you're almost like, was there some sort of ringer in for those other films, or maybe there is for this? Because how can the same person have directed that directed this and have such a short space of time between them?
Yeah, what was it that was going on in his life that this suddenly sort of something clicked into place?
Yeah. And for the most part, since Unforgiven, he hasn't looked back. Yeah,
I suppose. Yeah, in the years following this, you've got some interesting work. There are still Potboilers in there. Don't get me wrong, Scott. Like you say, he kind of introduced the sort of grumpy old man thriller. You've got some great stuff in there. In The Line of Fire, I absolutely love. A Perfect World is a pretty decent film, despite the albatross of Kevin Costner around its neck. Bridges of Madison County was pretty well received as far as I remember.
Well, let's assume it's terrible though, since Meryl Streep's in it. But
yes, Meryl Streep. Absolute Power is a decent enough political potboiler. Certainly an order of magnitude above the stuff that he was doing previously in that kind of genre. True Crime is alright. Space Cowboys, I'm going to pretend it doesn't exist. And then through to, I guess, in the early 2000s, Bloodwork, which is another entirely acceptable. There's a pretty terse joke in there if anyone's ever seen the film. Entirely acceptable.
In the middle of all that, he directed Mystic River, which is...
Oh, of course, yes, Mystic River.
Year after Bloodwork.
In the middle of that. Yeah, which again was like very well received and kind of sees, I guess, that decade more than any other sees him kind of hitting his stride again as an actor, but also sort of all of a sudden this great director has suddenly emerged after 35 years.
It just, there's something just seems to have crystallised in them in Unforgiven, and from that point it's just been like, oh right, now I get it. There are occasional potboilers in there, and certainly some of his other films have been a bit dull perhaps, but
I mean it's entirely to speculate, but do you think it's been some sort of realisation on his part? Because from what I remember, Unforgiven, and certainly what you guys have said seems to back up. It's quite introspective. It's quite inward looking in terms of people coming to terms with who they are and what's left now. Do we think that, I get the impression looking through this sort of stuff that for a long time he was a guy who just didn't want to admit that he was now a certain age, and I kind of feel as if by the time we got to Bird and then Unforgiven, it's almost as if I feel like maybe he's had this epiphany that suddenly, look, this is who I am, this is the reality of where I am and the age I'm at, and something's just sort of clicked into place, and he's decided to tackle things from that perspective rather than someone who's forever young and wants to fly imaginary fighter jets.
I mean, it possibly is because he actually bought the screenplay for Unforgiven about 10 years before he made it, but he'd said,
sat on it.
Yeah, because he said, I really, really like this and I want to play William Money, but I need to be older. And then spent a decade making terrible Dirty Harry movies and Firefox. Until he got to the point when he looked at this again and thought, yes, this is still brilliant, I'll make it. And you see how that turned out for him.
I wonder if there's an element of him, as I said earlier, he was thinking very much in terms of what an audience would like. And I think perhaps there's a danger that in that stretch of the 80s was like, what am I known for? I'll give the people what they want. And he kind of focus grouped himself to death by providing, basically what he thinks he should have been doing for an audience to go and like it. And I think at some point he might have just went, well, maybe I'll just do what my art tells me to, rather than what my business sense tells me to do. So that may have something to do with it. I'm not completely sure about that.
Yeah, there's only so many times I want to tell the mayor to shove this badge up his ass.
Yeah. Well, I'm another cop on the edge. All right, fair enough.
Now I'm an old retired cop on the edge. But there you go. And that takes us, I guess, through to his next movie for which he was nominated for Best Director at the Oscars, for any given value there. And that being $1 Million Baby.
$1 Million Baby being a boxing film, and on the surface, kind of an unremarkable one, because really there's nothing very special about the premise of $1 Million Baby. You have a down-and-out boxer, well, aren't they all in films, looking for their chance to shine in the ring and armed only with bagfuls of determination and eagerness. So this boxer latches on to a rather embittered and reluctant trainer and pins their hopes on him. And even the twist in $1 Million Baby that the boxer in question happens to be a woman doesn't make the setup a great deal more remarkable. That the trainer relents and makes the woman his protege, and that she goes on to become a successful boxer, makes the story seem even more ordinary. It's pretty much the template for how a boxing film would go. But one of the things that sets $1 Million Baby apart from other sporting underdog stories is that at the moment of what should be her greatest triumph, the boxer in question, Maggie, is sucker punched and has a fall, almost cartoonish as the scene actually is, which results in a paralysis from the neck down. And at that moment, when every other boxing movie would be ending with a victory note, $1 Million Baby almost begins again as a completely different type of film. It's like two films sandwiched together that have nothing to do with one another, and somehow it still works. And because the latter part of the movie deals with Maggie's paralysis, her bleak prognosis, and Frankie, who is Clint Eastwood's trainer character's, his acceptance of her death, and the part he must play in it. Because really, it ought not to be, and especially the boxing half of the movie, ought not to be anything special. It's very, very cliched and hackneyed and unoriginal, yet somehow it does work. And I think that's because everything about it is done so very well. The three main actors, Clint Eastwood, Morgan Freeman and Hilary Swank, all put in earnest, touching and believable performances. And Eastwood's direction is so taut and assured. It's low-key and intimate and quiet, where other films in the genre would be quite bombastic. But it's the second half of the film where it really stands out, and Eastwood's direction is key. Though you really have to say a lot about his tender and vulnerable performance as Frankie, which is frankly superb. It's one of the films, I think, where more than any other he's focused on his own acting when he's been directing rather than focusing on the other characters in it. And you just see this incredible performance from Eastwood and the performance from he's directing too, where all of the hallmarks of his craft are on show, and the deliberate pacing, the lack of sentimentality but not lack of emotion. And you just have this character who, it sounds kind of ridiculous to say he's like the stony faced guy with the heart of gold underneath, but you just see this person who has lost his daughter and effectively gained another one, a woman who didn't have a father who's gained one. And again, all that sounds so Hallmark, Lifetime TV movie. You see him gradually crack, him gradually accept this woman into his life.
I think the word you used before that I was going to use myself was vulnerable. What's compelling about it for me is that I haven't seen him play vulnerable before, and also it's the first time I have seen him properly play a father, which for someone with a career as long as this with 8 kids, I think it's the 8 kids that he has, I'm sure he's got some sort of fatherly instinct. And this is the first time, it's not the first time he's played someone's father on film, but it's the first time he's really taken a step back and played this sort of fatherly figure. And there were shades of it a couple of years later in Gran Torino as well, actually, but
yeah, with the neighbour kid, yeah.
It's the first time that I've been genuinely touched by one of his performances, I think, really sort of emotionally, and that he makes you feel that emotionally engaged with both his own character as an actor, but also with the character of Hilary Swank as a director. It's his most emotionally engaging film by some degree, and it could, like I say, it could so easily have been some sort of Sunday afternoon film of the week. It could have really gone down like a really sort of banal, sentimental route, and it doesn't. It's quite raw. It doesn't dwell on things. His character has the courage of his conviction, and he makes some very hard choices, obviously, without giving anything away. But I've never seen him play kind of openly vulnerable like that before, and at that sort of late stage in his career, to suddenly open that as a new avenue is like remarkably interesting. As much, if not more so, probably than Unforgiven.
It's certainly a film that's managed to blindside me twice now. I think once I either hadn't heard or forgotten about the twist of the paralysis happening in the film. So up until then I was going, yeah, this is an acceptable enough sporting underdog tale. And then that sucker punch and the rest of the film after that is such a sea change that it did manage to floor me at the time. I wasn't expecting it, and it got me. It also floored me a second time because I watched this again after a run of Dirty Harry films, and it's like, oh my gosh, he can actually do emotions. Certainly a sea change in the way that Eastwood shows himself on film as well, the vulnerability as well as the strength of the character, and his open questioning of what he needs to do towards the end of that film. Yeah, it's a tremendously effective performance, very engaging. Certainly that last, whatever it is, 45 minutes or so really does sort of take the film from being something completely ordinary into something extraordinary. It is remarkable the way that it twists on that axis, and does provide a hell of an emotional impact for a variety of reasons. There's a few cartoonish elements in there that I think could have been downplayed. I mean, in particular, Hilary Swank's on-film family is just cartoonishly evil.
Yeah, and then as is the boxer that does her the injury too. It's like because apparently her whole career is elbowing people while the referee's not looking, and she's never been banned for anything. So
that works in pro wrestling, but it's not going to do so well in Boston boxing.
There's a few things in there that is what would make it seem so unremarkable, but sort of rather in spite of those flaws, it seems to work very, very well because everything else is just handled so well.
This makes a really great double bill with Gran Torino. I've double billed that, and that's a really nice 1-2, and those two films pretty well encapsulate the naughties for him. Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, a lot of people see as missteps, but I think they're interesting directorial asides, and I think it is nice to see him try and do something different again. This is clearly a period in the sort of early to mid 2000s where he's decided to open up a different avenue and take a different approach and experiment with different things, and I think they're worth. I know people aren't as fond of Flags of Our Fathers as they are probably Letters from Iwo Jima, and even as a whole, the two films, they're not considered the greatest, but they're interesting and notable in terms of a change of direction.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting. I mean, Flags of Our Fathers, it's an interesting premise. The film's very boring. Letters from Iwo Jima, for him being such a staunch Republican too, it's perhaps surprising, but Letters from Iwo Jima isn't the best film, but it's so interesting that he's looking at this conflict from the point of view of the Japanese. So he is very much trying other things there, which is great.
One might not agree with his political leanings by and large, but it seems to indicate that at least he is capable of taking on board the perspective of the other side, and that perhaps that he's come to those conclusions, as an informed decision, whether or not you agree with him.
So, I mean, his run from Unforgiven, it's not without missteps, but it's been pretty solid. Although, perhaps it's been a bit like the whole, as you mentioned earlier, Craig, the whole even-numbered Star Trek thing. Because he did, after Mystic River and $1 Million Baby, he did seem to do a bit of a good one, bad one run. So he went on to do Changeling, which was terrible. Then Gran Torino Invictus. And Invictus is, again, another sporting underdog story, but just done extremely competently with an added interest in the Nelson Mandela character. Gran Torino's great. Then you have Hereafter, which is abysmal.
Yes, I've avoided that after you guys reviewed it in our previous podcasting incarnation.
J. Edgar, which I've still haven't got around to seeing actually. Jersey Boys, which Scott actually liked quite a bit, didn't you, Scott?
Yes, it's a perfectly ordinary biopic. It's sort of halfway between a biopic and musical, but it's interesting, it's inoffensive, it's not really doing anything out of the ordinary, but it's certainly an enjoyable watch. It's not redefining anything, but yes, it's perfectly adequate for what it does, and doing it a bit of a disservice. It's an enjoyable film. If you've even the vaguest interest in the subject matter, it's definitely worth a look.
So obviously we're talking mostly here about the films he's directed. He has still acted in a few along the way. He's directed himself in Gran Torino, etc., but he's also popped up in things like Trouble with the Curve, which is unremarkable but entirely enjoyable. I think that was after his 4th announcement of his retirement from acting.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're on 4 now. Could be more. He didn't seem to want to give up, but his work has, I wouldn't say progressed so much, because I don't think he's topped the likes of $1 Million Baby and Unforgiven. There's nothing been quite so good as that. Gran Torino's probably the closest thing to it, but he's kept up a pretty solid standard since then, with the occasional dip into terrible things like Hereafter. But then we have, as a director, his most recent film from last year, American Sniper, which is, for many reasons, perhaps one of the more controversial things he's covered.
Yeah, American Sniper I had mixed feelings about. I wouldn't go so far as to say I didn't enjoy it. I think it was a reasonably enjoyable film. It kind of sees elements of his political standpoint creeping back in. I think I described it in my offhand Twitter review as Bradley Cooper's big American propaganda gun shoots to the right or something like that. I want to say that almost kind of detracts from it. I think more than anything it suffers from still being too close to the subject matter. And I think that maybe if this were a film made 10 years from now, if this conflict that we see carrying on in the Middle East actually comes to some sort of conclusion, I think it's a film that would have been better served by having a little bit more distance between subject matter and production. I mean, as it stands, Bradley Cooper plays, who also produces, I think, plays the role of Chris Kyle in this biopic of the US Navy SEAL sniper, who is or was famous for having, I think, the most documented kills on record. And his career from, I think it was I've completely forgotten. What did he have? Did he grow up in some sort of small holding? Oh no, he was a rodeo guy, a rodeo cowboy.
Yes, all I could think of was rodeo clown. Like, it definitely wasn't
rodeo
that.
Clown. He was a rodeo clown. He ran away from the circus and he joined the military so that he could go and see the world. Yeah, so he worked in rodeos, and then after the attacks on New York, 9/11, decided to sign up and serve his country by going on to fight in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He showed a certain proclivity for his marksmanship and became a sniper within the Navy SEALs, and went on to shoot a lot of people, somewhat controversially, including children.
Yes,
which a great deal is made about in this film, and I think in the context of that conflict, even though the film portrays it very disingenuously, certainly in terms of what Kyle himself had written in his own biography, the film goes to great pains to lay these sort of difficult moral choices that Kyle had to make in his role as a soldier, to lay them out in front of us as though it intends to actually tackle them and analyse them in any way. And then, with a shrug of the shoulders, Kyle simply moves on and nothing more is really made of them. It also fails kind of in cat and mouse element of, there is also a sort of subplot of a sniper from the other side who happened to have been a former Olympic athlete, from what I can gather, who made it his mission to try and remove Kyle from the picture. So there's kind of an enemy at the gates, Vasily Zaitsev thing going on there as well. And it doesn't really handle that all that well either. That's almost by the by. It is the film's absolute failure to tackle, to investigate, and to shed any sort of insight on the thought processes, the ethics of some of the choices that these people are, the situations that these people are placed in on a daily basis. There's a fantastic movie to be made there, and certainly it's something I hadn't necessarily seen tackled if at all, then certainly all that well by other films. And I was quite intrigued as to how American Sniper would go about it. And the answer is it simply doesn't. And it's a huge missed opportunity. It's not a terrible movie. It's still a reasonably good film. It could probably do with being a little bit shorter. It's just, it seems like an odd misstep. And certainly I don't feel deserved to be quite so award considered as it was last year in the various sort of award ceremonies. But I mean, still interesting in certain respects. Not his greatest directorial endeavour. I think what's going to be interesting to see is what he does now. Is this going to be just a misstep, and is he going to pull something interesting out of the bag with his next movie, or is this going to signal a sort of another trip down the slippery slope of self-indulgence that he's fallen victim to before?
The only thing I've found particularly remarkable in American Sniper is how it seems to be made purely to have people project their own politics onto it. Because you can read this as anti-war, you could read this as pro-war. There's lots of ways you can fit your own narrative onto it, but it's been designed almost with that in mind, so that it doesn't have any of its own narrative. That's kind of why, Kyle's such a blank slate. He doesn't make any attempt at coming to any sort of rationalisation behind these decisions. It's a bit disappointing in that respect, because I can kind of see where it's going. I mean, if you are a soldier, you do not want your snipers questioning orders. So if you're ordered to kill a kid, then that is what you should be doing as a good soldier. You're not really supposed to be questioning that order, at least in terms of battlefield effectiveness. Probably wouldn't stand up at the Hague. But
no. Well, the interesting thing about that scenario though is that he's not ordered to do it. They basically back off from it and say, "Well, it's your call."
Yeah, that's true. And we see what that call is. But I just found the central character to be such a blank slate and so motionless. He has no real reaction to any of the thing he's doing. He just feels like he's doing a job. He may as well be, hammering nails into a bit of wood.
He may as
at
well
this point.
be the gun for all the emotion that he shows.
And because of that, the whole thing just felt incredibly flat to me. I couldn't really be bothered projecting any politics onto it. So my feelings on this are largely null. It's there, but it didn't really do anything for me one way or another. I was not engaged with it enough to really start thinking about what it was presenting by itself. It's been claimed that it's showing what happens to the people left behind in war and all these kind of things, and I don't think it does any sort of job of that at all. If you want something that's a bit more effective that way, go and see The Hurt Locker or something like that, which does a far better job of showing what's doing to its subjects. This film is just an excuse to start putting your own politics onto it, and I'm not really interested in that kind of argument. As a film itself, I don't think it holds a lot of water, and it was not particularly interesting in really any regard for me.
The deepest analysis of the scenarios that he finds himself in is basically for him to step back after each one and say, well, only God can judge me. I'm willing to have that discussion with him when I meet my maker, and just to have that fantastic Christian standpoint of, yeah, murder's all right in this circumstance, or whatever. It's not all that interesting to me, especially when it's just this mantra that gets repeated over and over and over. It forced me to disengage from the character of Kyle, at least as he was portrayed on screen. And the kicker of it is that actually, and it's not a plot spoiler because it's a news story that Chris Kyle was himself killed shortly after coming home by a former colleague of his who was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder when he was trying to help the guy chill out a bit at a firing range. Top tip, chill out somewhere else. Yeah, and actually shortly before that happened, I remember listening to an interview with the guy on Radio 4, and he actually was a fairly engaging character with something to say. I haven't read his biography, his autobiography, but I kind of want to see just how much of a hash this film made and actually what might have been. Yeah,
when bits of this film, the politics were very much not mine, but I think I'm largely with Scott that there certainly wasn't enough interesting there for me to really be bothered one way or the other. And it comes up with some sort of stuff. It's like the way they go on. It's like, oh, these people are the enemy. They're monsters. They're butchers. We must kill them. It's like, okay, that's an interesting starting point. Where are you going? Oh, you're not. Okay.
Yeah. There's no analysis whatsoever, and it's not even that it's asking you to draw your own conclusion, because it doesn't really give you enough material to work with.
No.
Here's a scenario. Here's the decision I made. Here's how that ended.
See, it's a bit of a wasted opportunity, American Sniper, really, because there were so many interesting angles that I could have taken about, how war affects the people who are waging it, how people are detached from the decisions that are made, and how the propaganda makes people believe that these people are bad or something or different. And it just didn't explore any of them.
I wonder that it was only ever going to be that way, though, because the logical conclusion of any kind of analysis into those scenarios is going to be something that an American cinema audience is going to rail against. The people who you'd imagine this film being targeted at probably aren't going to like being confronted by the truths of the situation and having too much of a mirror held up to their...
Certainly while the situation is still going on.
Yeah, exactly.
If this was a film about a sniper in Vietnam, it might have had an opportunity to be a bit more reflective on this thing.
Exactly. I think there's a better film to be made of this 10 years from now. Peace willing. Does anyone have a particular favourite directorial or acting gig from Eastwood along the way?
Ooh, interesting. I think... I don't know, actually. I think possibly Gran Torino. I mean, I wouldn't argue that it's his best acting or directing performance, but I just find Gran Torino very, very compelling. A very watchable film. He's quite a sympathetic character, quite interesting, but also believable.
I think Gran Torino latterly has been as a real favourite. I mean, I've obviously expressed previously my foolish and misguided love of The Rookie as a ridiculous piece of disposable entertainment, but I would also suggest that In the Line of Fire is a real personal favourite of mine, not one that we really touched on, but it's a film that holds up remarkably well even now, and I find myself going back to again and again, and I cannot wait to talk about The Eiger Sanction. I cannot wait. It's an absolute favourite for an entirely different set of reasons.
I could wait.
Yeah, did you watch it yet, Drew?
I have watched it. Yes, I could wait. That's all I'll say about that.
I love it. I absolutely love it. I'm so looking forward to that gig. But yeah, what about you, Scott?
Well, I think in general, I did end on something of a downer with him of using American Sniper there, but I think in general, Clint Eastwood has been a tremendous positive force for films. The good that he has done has outweighed the not necessarily bad. Even when he's bad, it's more that it's forgettable rather than it's actively terrible. So he's had a very storied and a great career. I think my favourites are probably still going to come back to a toss-up between Unforgiven and The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. The
Good, the Bad and the Ugly was certainly one I would consider for one of my favourites. But yeah, there's a lot. He's been a very prolific actor and director, and there's an awful lot there you can choose from that's very, very good.
Yeah. While it has its flaws, Dirty Harry is still tremendously enjoyable, and while it's clearly aged, it doesn't feel that it's dated somehow. That genotype that it maybe not invented but certainly popularised throughout the decades to come sort of holds up pretty well, and I think it's a strong performance too.
I think that's probably it for our thoughts on Clint Eastwood for this episode. As you can see, we're rather fond of the majority of, or rather a lot of his work.
Yeah, careful now.
Majority is the wrong word, sorry. Yes, I'm just remembering Hereafter again. We hope you've enjoyed that discussion. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can find us on Twitter at FudsOnFilm or on Facebook at FudsOnFilm. You can email us at podcast@FudsOnFilm. We're always looking to hear from people who listen to the show. Let us know what you think we could improve, whether you agree with our thoughts or not. We're looking for some healthy discussion. But until the next time, when we will be covering old men action movies, I have been Drew, Scott has been Scott,
ta-da,
and Craig has been Craig.
Fare thee well.